At school, religion is taught like everyone agrees. And if your understanding of religion comes from just those exams, you're missing almost all of it. In real life, even families don't agree. Today's conversation explores what happens when we flatten religion to fit into neat boxes, and why Sikh philosophy, practice, and history refuse to fit into that model. We're joined by Professor Eleanor Nesbitt, Emeritus Professor of Religions and Education at the University of Warwick, co-founder of the Punjab Research Group, and author or co-author of close to a dozen books, including Sikhism, A Very Short Introduction, and Sikh, 2 Centuries of Western Women's Art and Writing. So, with that in mind, let's dive in. I would first love to start right at the beginning, and I'm obviously very excited to have yourself on the podcast for various reasons. Not only as we shared at the live event that I attended one of your lectures when I was a lot younger, but also the Sikhism book from Oxford University Press. I remember having a copy of that when it came out. The Sikh book by Kashi House, the 200 years or so of female history and interactions with Sikhs as well. I have a massive copy of that on my shelf just behind me, and I haven't even got through all of it, and I'm absolutely in love with it. So, rewinding almost all the way back to the beginning, when you look back at your childhood in the 50s and 60s, a world that was still reshaping itself after the Second World War, what kind of world do you remember growing up in, and what was it like for yourself as a child growing up in that time period?
It's an interesting question. I didn't grow up in an industrial city in the Midlands or the north of England. I grew up by the sea in the centre of the south coast of England in a place called Christchurch, near a bigger town called Bournemouth, where I had my education. So for me, diversity consisted of my Jewish school friends, the Roma, the Romani, often called gypsies, in the New Forest, and the language students, most of whom came from mainland European countries. That was diversity for me. I remember going to London with my parents, perhaps when I was 8, and for the first time seeing Indian women and marvelling at their long black plaits and their saris. And that was about the extent of any encounter that I had with further east. But what I did have was my mother telling me that my grandmother's grandmother had gone to India. And when I think about it, she must have gone before the Sepoy Uprising. It must have been early 19th century. I can find no information about it, and I won't allow myself to be distracted by talking about that. But what it did was, I suppose, make me realise that India was somewhere one could go, and it made my mother realise it was somewhere that a daughter could come back from. And so I think it had quite an impact.
What were your parents' views of or attitudes of the world that was rapidly changing around them? Like they have essentially lived through the biggest turmoil of the 20th century, and now they're seeing this world recreate itself in a completely different phase. Like, did they ever share what they were thinking at that time?
No, and they didn't talk about the war that much, and that was true, I think, of most families at the time. And my father wasn't a combatant. He was in a reserved occupation working in telecommunications. And I actually heard very little about the war, except my mother explaining that she'd had to be a cinema projectionist as her war work. I realised, looking back, that rationing hadn't ended when I was a young child. Conscription for national service hadn't ended. In all sorts of ways, the war hadn't faded from the national experience. I remember my father coming to the consecration of Coventry Cathedral, which a new cathedral had been built in the 1960s in place of the one that was destroyed in 1940. So from time to time, the war would impinge. I remember my history teacher having a day off school because she was in London at the funeral of Sir Winston Churchill. And my parents did talk a lot about Sir Winston Churchill, not in a critical way at all, not in a post-colonial way.
It's always just really interesting, and thank you for answering that. I guess just then coming back to yourself. So you're growing up in a place outside of an industrial city, essentially. You're near Bournemouth. You're in a really nice, leafy place. As you're going through education, you eventually end up, obviously, this is further down the line, studying classics and theology at Girton. As you're going through your education, what was the pull or what was the interest that wanted or made you go in that direction? Why did you think, I'm going to do classics and theology? Like, what was the enjoyment or what was like the benefit that you...
I can answer these questions in so many ways. But, I mean, one thing is one tends to do things one's good at. And I was very good at Latin. You could get full marks in Latin, so that was attractive. Another thing, looking back, that interests me is that when my mother was expecting me, my father was studying Greek at home. So maybe there was some antenatal influence on me. I had no doubt that I was going to study Latin and Greek. And where the theology came from was my unhappiness with the constraints of the religious tradition I was brought up in, the fact that it was hugely important to my parents and that my father was actually ordained as a priest in the Church of England during the time I was at university. And I thought, well, if I study theology, I might begin to understand. But there was also something else, which I can't explain, but when I filled in my application forms for Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, for my subject, for my chosen subject, I put Oriental Studies. I had absolutely no idea what that covered or what I would do. And that was abundantly clear at my interview. I'm surprised they let me in, let alone give me a scholarship, because I remember the senior tutor saying, well, would you like to study Egyptology? Would you like to study this? Would you like to study that? And now I see it as this extraordinary premonition, really. And I see theology as being the start of my move eastwards, because at least it got me into the Middle East. And because theology was morphing into religious studies, and I took that option, it meant that I could at least investigate Islam and Judaism, as well as the Christian tradition. So I was moving eastwards.
So at what point then, or what was your initial kind of interaction then with Sikh traditions? Because I think it must be interesting for people listening to this to obviously have the idea in their head that you've written these books on Sikhism and Sikh history. And actually, when you start at the beginning, your interest is initially in theology, Judaism, Islam. So at what point do you, I guess, move further east?
Well, I heard myself saying, when people asked me what I was going to do when I left university, I heard myself saying, I'm going to India. Now, you can analyse that, and I can analyse it in all sorts of ways. I just knew that I was going to go. It wasn't something that I ever felt I made a decision about. And I was the sort of person who would get nerve-wracked by quite minor decisions. But going to India, I just knew that I was going to go. Now, you could say I was part of the hippie generation who were, heading off. You could say that lots of people were going, with a spiritual search in mind. I could rationalise and say, well, I was clearly interested in languages and cultures and philosophies and history, and wasn't India the obvious place to go if I was actually going to earn my keep while I was there, because I could teach in an English language institution? You can rationalise it in all sorts of ways, but I tend now, actually, to be quite frank, I felt guided.
Well, to be honest, I was just going to say, listening to you, it sounds like you were guided. It sounds like you kind of didn't necessarily make a conscious, quote unquote, choice. You were kind of just like, well, this is just the next step in what I'm going to do. And off I go. It
was one of the most definite bits of self-knowledge that I had. And I have felt, and I'm using religious vocabulary really, I have felt guided all my life. And there's been a lot of synchronicity, for want of a better word, a lot of serendipity, which has pointed the way. I mean, to give an example, when I came back from teaching in India, I'm jumping ahead a bit, I was teaching in Coventry. And just as in India, nearly all my students were Punjabis, though I wasn't in Punjab, and half of them at least were Sikh. So in Coventry, where I was teaching additional English, many of my students were Sikh. So I thought, well, how am I going to find out more about Sikhs. And I wrote to various universities. And it just so happened that Douglas Davis in the Department of Theology in the University of Nottingham had re-advertised a position funded by Nottinghamshire County Council for someone to come and do a study of the Sikh community of Nottingham. You know, I mean, things just dovetailed so extraordinarily.
One question that is a slight tangent, it's more so just because I am from Coventry, is what school did you teach at?
Oh, interesting question. Well, you see, I was employed by the Minority Group Support Service, which was set up with funding from Europe in 1977, the year in which I came back from teaching in India.
Okay.
And many of us were peripatetic. In fact, I was based in Ling Hall School, which at that time was a girls' school, so it did have a larger number of pupils from a South Asian background that it would have had otherwise. But I rejoined the Minority Group Support Service after a period of research in Nottingham. And then I was in a number of schools, primary and secondary. I much preferred being able to go to different schools and always be appreciated because I was needed and not to have all the bureaucracy.
No, I can imagine.
I can really recommend being a supply teacher. And of course, it gave me a glimpse into lots of different parts of the city and Indian and other types of families and so on.
Thank you. Anyway, coming back to the more meat of the topic. Obviously you said that you spent time teaching in India and that you felt guided. I guess one question with the experience that you had in India is, what were some of the things that when you came back, you were like, you know what, I would never have experienced what I experienced whilst I was in India had I stayed wherever it may have been?
Oh, definitely hospitality, the level of hospitality, the level of welcome. And I was shamed. And I found this when I looked through my letters, actually, fairly recently for another podcast that I did. I was conscious of the fact that in Britain, people from India were coping with racist reactions. And I was being treated as a sister or a daughter, somebody who was far from home and obviously needed to be looked after a bit. And yeah, I can't forget the generosity, and I can't forget the appalling feeling of shame at really how unjust it was. But you see, I was also almost being thanked for the railway. I mean, it was only later that I thought, well, Japan had a railway and they didn't need the British to provide it.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, when I look back, I was in Nainital, in what had been a British hill station from 1974 to 77. Actually, it's not that long after the end of empire. And there was one woman who was a colleague in the school who was very, very deaf. So she probably hadn't heard very much of the conversation around her as India had transformed into an independent country. And she powdered herself so that her face was absolutely white. And she referred to every Indian as that idiot. And she was loved and nurtured by her Indian colleagues.
Hey, I guess everyone has their place in the family, right? I love that story. I think that's quite a good way of actually illustrating how rapidly things must have changed. And actually, if you didn't keep up, you had no idea.
She would have been very shocked by me because I went down to the Mandir. I wore saris to teach. I sometimes had a bindi. And she must have been completely appalled. And of course, when I was there were only two ways in which local people viewed white people. They were either hippies or they were missionaries. And I'm not even sure that there was that much distinction between them.
And then you turn up and you're kind of nowhere near either of them, really. You're just there to teach and to immerse yourself in the culture. So they must have been really confused.
Yes, people were very confused. I mean, when I went to carnivorous households, they would cook meat specially for me and then be dismayed that I was a vegetarian. Because if they knew anything about white people, you know, they were not vegetarian.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is what I learned from India, what stereotyping does. So, for example, on another visit to India, when I burst into tears about something and my host said, well, why are you crying? And I said, well, I'm thinking of my mother who's in hospital. And the reaction was, but English people don't care about their parents.
And again, those type of stereotypes haven't necessarily left. So for argument's sake, I've had conversations with my peers and they're like, well, white people would never live with their parents at home. And it's an Indian almost stereotype that Indian households live in these extended family households. They're all in one house and stuff. But again, those stereotypes aren't they're stereotypes, so they're not actually true. But it's just interesting how it's the same thing, but it's evolved over time and hasn't necessarily left.
This experience of stereotypes, which generally were beneficial to me rather than not, they really opened my eyes to the stereotyping that we engage in this country. Whenever any of us meets somebody that we can pigeonhole somehow or the other.
So you were in India teaching English, immersing yourself in the culture, and then you mentioned you come back towards the end of the 70s. I think you said 77 earlier on.
Yes.
And then you mentioned that in the mid-80s you helped create the Punjab Research Group. Now, I have loads of questions about this, so I'll try and get through them. For me, it kind of feels obvious now the Punjab Research Group being set up in the 80s was so important. But back when you set that up, what was the goal? What was the plan? What was the vision? And then also, an obvious question with the 80s in mind is, how did events that unfolded in Punjab in the 80s, and especially obviously after 84, then influence or impact the way the Punjab Research Group continued?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I think I'm probably fabricating the history of it. I think that my co-founders, for example, Shinder Thandi, who has written about it, have a much clearer memory of how it all came about. My recollection is that in the early 1980s, some of us, Shinder, Darshan Singh Tatla, some of us realised that we were in this niche group of people who were studying Sikhs, or Sikhism, as we called it very often, and from different disciplinary backgrounds, and with no particular sort of university niche into which we fitted. But we shared in common this passion for researching Punjab and Sikhs in particular. And I think we were very aware of the mounting tensions in the subcontinent. We were very aware that the Punjab was bigger than Indian Punjab, that most of it was in Pakistan. The Punjab Research Group would be a group that would bring together scholars, students at all levels from Pakistan, from West Punjab, from Indian Punjab, East Punjab, and from the diaspora. They would be scholars at every stage in their career, from graduate students, mainly PhD researchers, through to senior academics. As I said, from a multitude of disciplinary backgrounds. And that just became more and more important as a vision, as various sorts of division and divisiveness increased in the media and, of course, in reality, in terms of conflict in Punjab, in terms of tensions that recurrently built up between governments of Pakistan and India, and so on. And so it was this wonderful experience, three times a year, and then more recently twice a year, meeting with people with this shared interest, but from such different backgrounds, and particularly seeing people of Pakistani background, and even from Pakistan, and of Indian background, or straight from India, happily engaging together with their shared language and their shared interests.
Over the decades, obviously, Punjab Research Group, as you rightfully said, has become a home for scholars, writers, community voices, people from all walks of life and all kind of strands of kind of the academic ladder. What moments for you, when you look back, do you kind of count as standout signs that the Punjab Research Group is doing something kind of quite monumental?
There aren't any particular moments, because every meeting was this sort of celebration of interdisciplinarity and crossing of boundaries, discovering shared interests, and so on. So I did quickly sort of look through records of past meetings, but I can't actually say any of them was monumental. I didn't go to two meetings that I think were particularly significant, and that was in a significant anniversary year when Professor Pippa Virdi, who was then the convener, actually organised meetings not only in Britain, but also in Chandigarh and I think in Lahore. Certainly one meeting was in Indian Punjab and one was in Pakistani Punjab, as well as in diasporic Punjab.
That sounds like a meeting I would love to have been a fly on the wall for. So yeah, I can completely understand. For this podcast, I was obviously researching and digging into some of your past work to ensure that I knew what I was talking about, but also to ask you some questions. And one of the things that I came across was your qualitative research that you spoke about earlier in respect to Sikh and Hindu communities. Now, I was reading some of the papers that essentially were referencing it and were saying that your work was essentially very much seen as a model in this field. So I just wanted to ask, when you were speaking to people and listening to their stories, and I know this was some time ago, what did you begin to understand about the community that perhaps you hadn't expected or hadn't kind of been gleaned out from, say, just textbooks? Like, what was it about talking to people or the lived experience that brought something to you that wasn't apparent?
Basically, it was continuity and change. The many continuities and the many forms of change. And diversity between communities, within families. And I think, actually, that is what is so important. And it's important for the presentation of religion, for example, in schools. Just think about your own family. I don't know of any family where everyone of every generation, of both genders, of every sort of level of ability and interest, actually believes and practices in the same way as the others. And it also, just during people's lifespan, and this was particularly actually evident around 1984, within people's lifespan, their degree of religiosity and their degree of manifest religiosity can change dramatically, especially if they happen to be Sikh. There's sort of visual evidence of the changes that are underway. But I think also one of the things that concerned me was the limitations of the history that in every community, young people and then adults live with. And that made me very sad to think how different history was in the Gurdwara, in families that went to the mandir, and I'm sure in families who went to the masjid, to the mosque. They all, I'm talking about Punjabis, of course, they all had histories that related to Mughals and the British and partition and so on and so on, but with a different set of heroes, a different set of martyrs. And that concerned me. And there's nothing in the British educational system to challenge that. That it's in the schools where it needs increasingly to be possible to present a history, whether it's in history lessons or RE lessons or wherever it happens, that is inclusive and balanced. But I don't quite know how it can be achieved. How can any teacher be an expert, let's face it, in hundreds or even thousands of years of history of every part of the world that their students have come from? I mean, it's just not realistic. But I think, going back to particularly religious education, if teachers could just very early on say to children, think about your own family, think about how differently your parents, grandparents, brothers, sisters, your family overseas, your family here, etc., just how differently they experience being a Sikh or a Hindu or whatever, and realise that here in school we can't help but give you shortcuts and give you stereotypes and generalise, but all the time you've got to hang on to that thought that it's just much more complicated than that. But of course the big enemy is the structure of examinations and syllabuses, which publishers as well fall into. So, for example, I can think of a colleague, Sarah Thorley, who produced a very popular series of books for schools on the main religions that we talk about in religious education. But when she came up with the idea of an interfaith one, the publisher wasn't interested. because it doesn't fit into any of the boxes. And so it's quite hard, actually, being a teacher, where you've actually got to be quite seditious if you want to educate children. But, I mean, I realise the ridiculousness of things when, for instance, I had a phone call just before a GCSE exam, I think, from a young Hindu lad who in fact lived in Ireland. And he was asking me how he should answer a question, I think, if it was on pilgrimage. I think it was on pilgrimage. Whatever it was, he was asking me, as the outsider, how he should write about what was his tradition. And he was brought up in, a devout and observant home. And then I remember seeing a sort of standard answer that had been devised for a question that could occur in a GCSE paper of why do Hindus go on pilgrimage? Okay, so there were a number of reasons, but they weren't the reasons that I knew that Hindus in my circle in Coventry went on pilgrimage. And pilgrimage didn't split off neatly from tourism and seeing relatives and so on and so on. And it was very often to do with, a prayer having been answered. And that didn't figure at all in the standard expected answer.
Talking about serendipity earlier, my next kind of few questions neatly fit into what you've just said, but equally I got contacted by a assistant head teacher at my old secondary school who also helps to formulate the RE syllabus for all of Coventry, I think, or whatever
the local agreed syllabus. Yeah.
And so she got in touch essentially to talk to myself as a Sikh in order to help them with guidance of putting together the syllabus for Sikhi. And her whole thing, and hence why I've asked some of these questions, her whole thing was that we're talking to you because we want to hear a lived experience from a Sikh. And I was saying to her that this is what I wish would have happened when I was a child, because I remember going into an RE class and being given a worksheet that said, I can't remember what it was, but it said something about Sikhs. And I was like, this doesn't actually match with what I do at home. So am I wrong, or is the school wrong? And so that's just a bit of the context, because the questions that I want to then move on to are, how can religious education, how can teachers, how can schools, as you said, like these books, everything, the textbooks that are produced with the exam in mind. And if they're not kind of one directional, the publishers are often, they don't want to touch them. But how can we try and change that so that we move from textbook definitions to perhaps recognizing more lived experience?
Well, I think a lot of RE is not for exams, and there's plenty of scope in the primary school if the teacher has the confidence, but it's difficult. I was privileged to be part of the Commission on Religious Education, which published its report in 2018. And it is quite clear about the entitlement which every student in school in this country should have available to them. And the commissioners very much drew on the sort of research that I was involved in. It informs the change of title for the subject to religion and worldviews, the emphasis on including insights from disciplines like anthropology, ethnography, and I think the more that religious education is in school, can implement the guidance that came from the research and the insights of the RE Commission, the better it will be.
No, thank you. That helps me more and more so then, because I just thought it was quite serendipitous to be able to do this podcast with you soon after they got in touch, and I was like, I think this is the perfect person to ask this question. So thank you for the help with that. Moving on with your work again in focus, you've examined how Sikh history is represented across academia, within communities, and popular narratives. What do you think are some of the most persistent misconceptions or kind of stereotypes in the way Sikh history or philosophy or religion is told?
That's a difficult one, and I have to tread carefully. These subjects are very sensitive. I think part of the problem, perhaps, is that researchers themselves, academics themselves, are very often limited in the number of languages that they are competent with, and therefore the range of sources that they can use. And for a lot of Sikh history, actually, one needs to be looking at sources in Farsi or in not necessarily in English or in Punjabi and Gurmukhi script. And also, I think also another problem is, and I'm saying this as somebody who comes from a Christian background, that if Sikhs are to be regarded as a world religion, whatever that means, and I could go on about that, but I won't at this point, there has also to be the acceptance that you are open for scrutiny and that your history is contested, and that academic investigation should be free from fear. And there has to be some sort of general understanding that there is a difference, but to put it in brief, between the pulpit and the podium. A Christian priest is unlikely most of the time to get up and in the pulpit start talking about textual criticism or raising some of the issues that might be discussed in a university seminar relating, let's say, to the history of the church in the first centuries after the life of Jesus, when actually there wasn't a clean break between Greek and Roman and other sorts of pagan religion and Christian religion and philosophy, and everything was much more messy than that. Now, somehow or other, I'm not confident yet that Sikhs as a whole who are concerned, academically or not, with their history and with their identity, are able to cope with the idea that it's actually a sign of the maturity of a faith and the significance of a religion, that actually there's nothing that can't be discussed and analysed and questioned, and that the response to something which you disagree with is to engage in careful research yourself and to politely or in a scholarly way provide counter-arguments. And I think that the Sikh tradition has lost a lot from the actual fear that academics have experienced, the limitations that they feel in the subcontinent and in North America and to some extent in Europe, including Britain, because of the backlash that can come in a number of forms, perhaps in efforts to remove them from their university departments or to vilify them or to boycott them or whatever. And there has been a tradition of this right the way through the period that I've been engaged in Sikh studies. And I'm very saddened by it, given what I've said about the generosity and the hospitality of Sikhs and their tradition. I feel that history has lost a lot because of the constraints within which people unnecessarily have been working.
You've literally condensed into a nutshell how I think a lot of people who are trying to engage in this area with good faith feel. With then your publication with the very short introduction, and I think one thing about that is that it's such a small little brilliant book, and I think what's great about this is that it's accessible without oversimplifying anything. And for someone who has a really hard time trying to simplify things without like bogging it down in jargon, what were some of the biggest challenges of introducing, say, Sikh history or belief or philosophy to readers who wouldn't necessarily have much of a background, but also doing it in a way that conveys that as kind of holistically or as completely as possible?
Well, I think it's the challenges that anybody faces when they are presenting something huge and partly unfamiliar to their audience. It's a not taking for granted that people know certain things, but it's also are not taking for granted that they do, because they may invest a different meaning in certain words, like, I don't know, priest or something. So I've been hugely appreciative of the very positive response that Sikhs all over the place have voiced, for this book. So I feel as if I must have sort of struck the right balance. I'm a very slow writer. I'm a poet, and poetry just comes out quickly. But when I'm writing prose, I write very slowly, and each sentence tends to be quite chiselled. So that basically there's a weighing up, not just of every page or every paragraph, but every line and every word, to try to make sure that I'm not overgeneralising or mystifying or whatever. What's been very helpful to me over the years has been that for a number of publications I have co-authored. I mean, most recently, actually, and this is another small orange book, with Nikki Singh in America, so Sikhism, the Basics. And when you're working when you're an outsider, well, we're all outsiders and insiders to different extents in what we're writing about. But broadly speaking, if I'm being an outsider and I'm writing with an insider, that sharpens me up quite a lot. I see what it is that perhaps needs to be reinforced or needs to be omitted, and where the sensitivities are. So it has been very helpful to me over the years for a number of projects to have been honoured to be the co-author with a Sikh. And, for example, way back, it was with Darshan. And it was actually possible to produce an annotated bibliography of everything that had been written on Sikhs in prison. I mean, that was about 40 years ago. It'd be harder now, even though you'd have AI to help you. And I co-authored an autobiography with Kailash Puri. Okay, that was her pool of life. And that a very positive experience as well. We was co-authoring the book on Guru Nanak with Gopinder Kaur. And each time I was learning in a way that would help me when I was single author of work on the Sikh tradition. And so that has been, very helpful.
I guess that brings me on to your latest work, which I have down over there, it's really, really quite a heavy book. I think I weighed it the other day and it was like 2-point-something kilos or something.
Oh, I think it's more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like close to 5 kilos or something, quite ridiculous. It's an insane piece. It's a catalogue. Let's just call it that.
Blame the publisher. Publishers normally say we can't include that. It's too expensive or whatever. I
think it's worth it.
I had a publisher who said, no, put it in. We want more.
Yeah, and why not? Because these type of books are worth their weight in gold now and will be very important, I think, in future years. It obviously catalogues voices of Western women who wrote about Sikhs across 2 centuries. And a couple of questions with this. First of all, I just want to ask, how long did it take you to do all of that research? And how long did it take you to put that book together? Because it is not a small book by any means whatsoever. And it's meticulously catalogued too. So I'm kind of just like, what lifetime did you spend putting that together?
We probably better explain to people who don't know what we're talking about that it's a book called Sikh, 2 Centuries of Western Women's Art and Writing. And it's published by Kashi House. And if you go to www.kashihouse.com, you immediately find yourself listening to a video of me talking about, you're stronger than me. Yes.
How
long did it take me? I can't answer the question.
Yes.
I was commissioned to do it in 2017 because Sikhism, A Very Short Introduction, had just gone into its 2nd edition. And I think that motivated Kashi House and actually OUP, both of them, to say, what would you like to publish next? And actually, I didn't fully understand when Paramjit Singh Parmjit from Kashi House said, what is there? What gaps are there that need to be filled? And I said, well, I've come across compendia of Western sources on Guru Nanak Dev Ji and on Sikh history, and it just happens that almost everybody who's included is a man. So it would be really good to see if any women ever wrote about Sikhs, apart from Dorothy Field, who published her book in 1914 on the Sikhs. I didn't quite realise that what I was doing was suggesting that I might do this. Anyway, also, when he asked me if I would do it, I thought, oh, well, there'll probably be about 10 people, so yes, I can manage that. So that was in 2017, and it was finally published in 2024. But I can't say that I spent all my time writing the book in between, because I wrote a number of articles, partly in the fear that the book would never come out, so I wrote articles on a number of chapters. And I also wrote a little book on Quakers and other faiths, because I'm a Quaker and I was commissioned to do that. But, you see, I wasn't working on it single-handedly. I said several times to my publisher, will you please put your name as co-author? Because he did so much in terms of finding material, in providing the wonderful illustrations, of which there are over 440, I think, and just generally inspiring the whole project. So I don't feel as if it was single-authored. I feel as if it was co-authored. So anyway, a short answer would be it took from 2017 to 2024. But what I realise as I look at it is that I could only have the confidence to do what I did because of that sort of hinterland of having worked on different Sikh communities and different aspects of Sikh history over the years. And I think it's worth explaining that my actual education in Sikh Studies came very much because of a scholar called John Bowker, who has just celebrated his 90th birthday. He was one of my tutors when I was at university. And along with being a scholar, writing very serious books in the field of religious studies, over the years, he has published a number of both coffee table books and reference books. For example, the Oxford Dictionary of World Religions, the Cambridge Illustrated History of Religions, and so on. And whenever he did that, there would be a Sikh section. And for whatever reason, he always asked me to do it. And that meant what happened was, instead of saying, well, of course I can't do it because I don't know about, let's say, the missals, or I don't know about Maharaja Ranjit Singh, or I don't know about whatever, I would always say, yes, I will do it. And that meant that I had to research it, and I had to research it in a way that I would write something of publishable quality within a particular time frame. And that was my education in the whole range, the whole timescale of Sikh studies. It wasn't just the ethnography that I'd done, in the late 20th century. It was all of that. So that was there in the background as I worked with what the women in my 2024 book were describing, reporting, commenting on. If I hadn't had that background and a sort of confidence in the framework into which it would all fit, it would have been a very different exercise. Of course, there were some things which I still knew absolutely nothing about. I'm not somebody who's into warfare. So the Anglo-Sikh wars were quite a challenge for me. But, I just got down to it. I sort of mapped out the sequence of battles and everything. And then I looked at what each of my women had said about each of the battles. I sifted out what was very definitely what their husbands had said, and tried to, as far as possible, have what they themselves had observed or experienced. And that was certainly true, actually, for 1857, when a number of them were caught up in the uprising, and they diaried, they journaled, and then published their own experiences and their experiences of Sikhs who were, well, of course, the narrative is that the Sikhs supported the British, but it was a bit more complex than that. So I was able to hear some of the nuance within a framework which I was having to actually research a bit for myself because that hadn't been part of what I had come across. But by and large, the lives of the gurus, or the development of the Sikh Maryada or whatever, these were areas that I'd had to engage with because of doing pieces of writing mainly for work edited by John Bowker.
With the massive Sikhs 2 centuries of Western women's art and writing, what is, or I know there's as you said, there's over 440 pieces of material, and there are hundreds of women included. For you,
170 plus, yes.
wow. For you, which is what I guess it's actually quite a hard question to pick because that's a lot of people to pick from. But for you, what are, say, one or two of the one or two of the women that stand out for you, and something that they may have said or shared that you were like, this is a really interesting tidbit or piece of information?
Oh, well, so many of them. And I probably sort of pick them out in date order. I was very excited by revisiting the work of Emily Eden, because she was not only writing in a very lively way, she's often sort of described as writing in a Jane Austen-like way with her sharp wit and so on, but she was painting professional standard, competent, beautiful watercolours of Nihang Singhs and Kali Nihangs, I mean, and
they sell for thousands when they go to auction even today. So
yes.
Even her sketches, it's
Yes.
insane. I think some of them went to auction just recently, and they go for like £5,000 to £10,000 per art piece. So
yes, that's right. And in fact, there's going to be a book coming out about her, and I've just done the chapter on Emily Eden and the Sikhs, because she is really quite an important source. And then if I move closer to our own time, I was very impressed by Eva Mary Bell, who actually wrote novels under the name of John Travers, who was her grandfather, who was an Irish/Canadian archbishop. But why I was impressed with her was because she was a war widow herself. Her husband, George Bell, had died. Actually, he was invalided out from Mesopotamia to Kashmir, and he died there in 1916.
wow.
And she took it upon herself to visit the widows of the men who had fought in his Punjab regiment. And she didn't just visit them in a sort of condescending way. She tried hard to communicate with them with solidarity as somebody who was herself widowed. And she was passionate about improving their lot, and she hoped that she could actually create communication between them and war widows in Britain. So I became really interested in her, and in fact, I'm going to talk about her in January in Hampton Court, which is where she spent the last 10 years of her life in a grace and favour apartment, and where her husband is commemorated actually in the chapel. Now, as soon as I talk about her, I'm getting into the area of friendship. Emily Eden wanted desperately, and her sister Fanny, they wanted desperately to be able to communicate direct with the Maharanis, with the women of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court. But they were stuck. They didn't have a shared language. It had to be through intermediaries. Eva was doing her best to communicate in the language of the women. Of course, gradually, more and more Sikh women, both in India and in the diaspora, were becoming fluent in English. So when you get, for example, to Dervla Murphy, who is certainly Ireland's most famous travel writer, she died, 2 years ago, her life was changed by somebody called Man Kaur, who was her Sikh pen friend. In those days, I mean, it was the same for me. We had pen friends in different parts of the world. Her pen friend lived in Malaysia. She was a Sikh. Dervla was an Irish Catholic. Writing to Man Kaur, she found that her attitude to her Catholic upbringing changed, and she realised that she must go to India. There was only one way she could do it. She looked at the atlas. She had a bicycle. She realised that she could cycle to Punjab with just 2 stretches of water in between. And that's what she did when she was in her early 30s. She cycled to Punjab and she wrote about what she experienced on the way and when she was there. A lot of what she says sounds quite simplistic and dismissive and so on. But what I love about that is that you have a woman whose life is changed actually by a young Sikh woman. We didn't know that that would be the effect of her correspondence. And then you see it again with J.K. Rowling. And J.K. Rowling, like Dervla Murphy, did interviews on Radio 4 and spoke about this phenomenon herself when she published The Casual Vacancy, which was her first novel after the Harry Potter series. The central female characters are Sikhs. Well, why? Because when she was a young woman, she had a Sikh friend. And the Sikh woman friend told her about this religion, which, promoted equality and so on. And J.K. Rowling was very impressed. And again, what I love is the fact that conversation, an ordinary person's conversation, can actually make such a difference to somebody else. I'm giving, obviously, because we're talking about Sikhs, I'm giving Sikh examples. And these are the examples, I gave when I went to the Artem Academy, the Sikh school in Romford in Essex. Because I think it's inspiring especially for youngsters to know. It's also quite frightening for all of us to realise that what might be almost random words can have so much impact. But I could single out so many of the women and say, well, that they were remarkable. Frida Bay's example.
Is there one that you would love to have met? Just, you can only pick one though, because I'm out of 170. Dear. That's quite a hard, because obviously I think I can relate, because I think as someone who studies this, you actually very much, you almost become friends with these people that you're studying, but though you've never met them.
Well, because I have met some of them, because some of them are alive.
Oh, wow.
Elizabeth Cosmian, who is responsible for the wonderful pictures of village life in the 1970s. She is a British-Polish artist. So it's very exciting to be able to talk to people. And she was one of the first to actually be recording the sound of Punjab, including the sound of Sikh worship. So, yes, I have had the privilege of meeting or speaking on the phone or exchanging letters with a few of them, and, of course, with descendants of some of them. That has been very exciting. Which one would I really like to meet? Well, I think at the moment I'd really like to meet Eva, because she could help me with my presentation. Eva Bell.
I think... So a number of things kind of fold into this next question, which is, obviously I have used your books when I was doing my university degree. I still have your books because they are of such good quality. And I think, so obviously when we did the live event, I remember every time that someone would buy a ticket, I would get an email and it would say the person's name that is coming. And when your ticket came through, I went, hold on. This can't actually be who I think it is. And it was more so for me, I think, it was almost like a stamp of things, like you're doing something good, because if it's attracting the attention of people like yourself, hopefully it's worth it, right? And I think it's also quite a poignant thing for me to have had you at the live event, because for me, you are one of the people who helped to establish Sikh Studies in UK academia and give it the structure and the foundation that it's then built upon over the last 40 years. As you said earlier, when you held up the book that you had co-authored with Darshan Singh Datla, you said there was a bibliography at the back that basically covered everything up till that point, and we all know just how much it's grown since. But going back to that point, what were some of the biggest hurdles that you were facing then? But then equally, now that we're on this side, how does it feel knowing that the work that you put in has inspired generations of other people and has influenced generations of other people? And in some respect, the live event we did, I can show a thread going back from it to yourself. So I guess, what were the challenges, but also what were some of the biggest rewards, or how do you feel knowing that the work you guys are putting in?
Well, it's just incredibly humbling when people say things like that, and I'm always frightened of falling off my perch, because it is a bit of a tightrope to study any religion, and especially to write about it, and especially when there are political dimensions, which there are with every religion.
Yes.
So one does spend one's life on a tightrope, and so I'm always prepared to fall off it. And yeah, it gives me obviously more of a sense of responsibility that I really must fact check what I write and measure what I say and so on. And my main message is just my thankfulness to, in this case, the Sikh community for their responsiveness and their welcome, because they could easily say, well, what's this outsider doing, trampling on our sacred ground and being presumptuous enough to write about us. So yeah, I feel it's empowering to go on treading cautiously.
No, definitely. My penultimate question is that throughout your work that you've done, you have very much emphasized that communities, especially minority communities, are not monolithic by any degree. And I think your example at the beginning, I don't think I'll ever forget, which is actually religion, even within a family, is not uniform, or how you practice it is just not the same. How then do you think scholars, teachers, policymakers can avoid flattening those complexities when we're engaging with religion, or we're discussing it, or teaching it, or debating it?
I think they just have to flag that up. And I think another thing, maybe it doesn't answer this question, but it's something important, is that to an extent one needs to be transparent in explaining the extent to which one is an insider or an outsider to whatever it is one is talking about or writing about, so that people can actually begin to gauge what one's assumptions and prejudices and advantages might be in exposing and expounding a particular part of the human experience. But of course, one's selective. I mean, I let people know that I'm a Quaker, but I don't always. Well, yeah, at least you can give some clues as to where you're coming from, and they can then sort of assess what you're saying in the light of that. I don't know that it's so important in school, but I think it's quite important with other groups that one's working with. But I think as far as the flattening and so on goes, there's an article that I did for a handbook of sociology on the teacher as ethnographer. And I think if everybody is approaching as an ethnographer, whether they are the person who is writing and speaking or the person who is hearing and learning, and actually we're all, I hope, hearing and learning, if we just try to develop those ethnographic skills, which are not, they're often described as participant observation, but it's much more participant listening. If we can develop those skills of listening, whether we're on public transport or in a lecture hall or wherever or in the Gurdwara or wherever it is, then we are no longer going to have a sort of flattened view of what's going on, because it's changing from second to second, and we are listening and responding to it with the sort of fascination that an ethnographer has of finding the familiar, finding the ways in which the strange can be familiar and the familiar needs to be made strange. Yeah, I think if we just regard ourselves as ethnographers, all of us, and it also can diffuse situations because everything becomes interesting.
No, definitely. My last question then. As the world continues to change, and I think just even in the last few decades, as you said with that little book, just even in Sikh Studies, how the field's exploded. But as this world continues to change, what questions or areas do you think the next generation of scholars or people who come into this field should be looking at or asking or dare to ask that we haven't actually looked at yet? So for argument's sake, I think the 2 centuries of Western women's art and writing is a brilliant piece of work because it plugs a gap which I wasn't necessarily aware was even there, but now that the work is there, you can see what it was filling. Equally, where do you think the next set of academics, researchers, scholars should be putting their attention.
Well, I mean, I should stress that what I've put together, I've compiled a source book, if you like.
Yeah.
Other people can work analytically on it. There's no way that I could have written sufficient depth and analysis about a 200-year, time span and so on. So there is material for other people to run with. I do think that there has got to be a lot more encouragement of learning the languages, whether it's Farsi, whether it's various mutations of Punjabi or whatever, in order to engage with a much wider range of source material, especially as I'm told reliably that a lot of material in Pakistan and maybe in India as well is really running the risk of physically decaying and disappearing. It just needs to be conserved and read, and people need to be somehow able to open-mindedly engage with what are often regarded as very sensitive subjects, like the various shahidis in Sikh history, the various martyrdoms, in quotes, because obviously martyrdom is an emotionally loaded word which is used by insiders. I think, too, that it will be wonderful if there can be more work in the area of musicology, of music, because, in school especially, it's very easy to give the idea that it's the spoken word and the written word that's so important, but in the Sikh tradition, it's the sung word. And there is, work underway, I know, but I think it would be great if there's, more and more of it. And actually going back to the issue of how you present material in school, I don't know if there are ways without actually showing disrespect to the tradition, whether there are ways in which Shabad Kirtan and so on can actually become something which children and older students hear and engage with. Those are just a few thoughts. But of course, Sikh history will go on and on evolving, and there will be a need to study whatever new transformations and modifications there are. In Britain, things are changing. For example, we've had the Sikhs from Italy coming in and Gurdwara forming to accommodate Italian Sikhs. So, there is always something new that's happening, which is also going to be a fascinating subject of study.
Thank you. I remember when I first started this podcast, I think I put you on a list. I wrote a list of 100 people that I wanted to include on the podcast. And I can't remember what, but I don't think I could find a contact detail when I first started for yourself. So to have you eventually on the podcast is an absolute honor. I've loved talking to you for the past hour or so. There's a lot more that I wish I could ask you, but I don't want to keep you for too long. And also I don't want to bore everyone listening. I think what we'll do is we'll save it for another time. And thank you not just for the time today, but thank you for all the work that you have done to this point, because a lot of it has been instrumental in the work that I have done personally. And as I said, I have your books. I remember numerous times including you in references and bibliographies and footnotes and all sorts of essays and stuff. So, I for one really, really appreciate it. And the field is a better place because of the work that you have done. So, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for including me in the series. And I hope that there'll be people who do manage to track me down and correct me about anything I've said wrong or give me more information.